Hello, and welcome to the first of my 6 short talks about the rise and fall of the Nazis. But before I start, it's important for me to say this. You should always bear in mind that the issues I cover in each of these talks have, over many years, been the subject of multiple volumes by various other historians, and that given the length of the talk, I can only offer an overview, one that I hope encourages you on to further studies. That said, in this first talk, I'm going to discuss how and why it was possible that Hitler and the Nazis ever came to power in a cultured nation at the heart of Europe. And the best place to start in answering that question, I think, is to emphasize how the Second World War was very much the child of the First. So much so that without the First World War, the Great War as it was known at the time, Adolf Hitler would never have become Chancellor of Germany. Indeed, it's doubtful if he would ever even have entered politics, or whether the Nazi Party as we know it would exist. What's significant isn't just that the Germans, as we all know, lost the First World War. Crucially, it was that in the summer of 1914, many Germans were enthusiastic about the conflict ahead. Germany, don't forget, had only been formed as a country less than 50 years before, and so many in this new country asked what exactly it meant to be a German rather than a Bavarian or a Prussian. Many thought this war would resolve that question and unite them all. As Kaiser Wilhelm II said that August, "I no longer recognize political parties, I recognize only Germans." It's also important to remember, as scholars have contextualized in recent years, that there were, of course, some Germans who weren't enthusiastic about the war. But the fact remains that many people almost felt a sense of euphoria. That was certainly the case for a 25-year-old painter of pictures for tourists, an Austrian who was living in Munich in the south of Germany at the time. His name was Adolf Hitler. He later wrote of his feelings in the summer of 1914. Even today, he said, "I am not ashamed to say that overpowered by stormy enthusiasm, I fell down on my knees and thanked heaven from an overflowing heart for granting me the good fortune of being permitted to live at this time. A fight for freedom had begun, mightier than the earth had ever seen." And initially, it seemed that all this optimism and excitement might be justified. The German army advanced, and in the first few weeks it seemed as if Paris could be under threat. But it was a false dawn, and soon the Germans on the Western Front became bogged down. What followed was 4 years of horrendous trench warfare. Despite this, commanders in the German army kept up optimistic propaganda throughout the war about the way things were going. Any defeats suffered, they said, were only temporary setbacks. This meant that when the end of the war came in November 1918, large numbers of Germans were shocked. After all, they'd been told positive news about what was happening. They didn't know the extent to which they'd been lied to, and that the German army had been losing the war for years. To avoid further suffering, the German government authorized their forces to give up, with almost all German soldiers still fighting outside of the country. This added to a sense of bewilderment many Germans felt about why the war had suddenly ended. But at the same time, there were those who didn't want to carry on the fight a second longer. There was a mutiny in the navy, and a communist revolution threatened. Lenin and his Bolsheviks had overturned the established order in Russia just the year before, so this threat was very much on people's minds. Amidst this febrile atmosphere, many on the nationalist right sought an answer to what they considered a profound and perplexing question. how had the perceived unity of the country in the summer of 1914 turned into this terrible disaster, with Germany seemingly splitting apart? In their search for scapegoats, they spun one overarching conspiracy theory. The war was lost, they claimed, because socialist politicians and Jews behind the lines in Germany had plotted to betray the soldiers on the front line. It was a myth that became known as the stab in the back. And even though there's no evidence that it was true, a figure as prominent as Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, the leader of the German army, supported this fiction. This feeling of betrayal felt by the nationalist right was exacerbated in the wake of a socialist uprising in Berlin in early 1919, one that was soon crushed, and the brief existence of a Soviet republic in Munich that was likewise quickly suppressed by government forces and right-wing paramilitaries. A number of the leaders of these revolutions were Jewish, and this only served to feed another conspiracy theory, that the Jews were behind communism. This then was the environment in which Adolf Hitler, now a 30-year-old ordinary soldier, entered politics in the summer of 1919. Up to this point in 1919, Hitler had shown no interest in becoming a professional politician. Something of a misfit, his only desire had appeared to be to remain in the army, the one home he really had. But now, like many in Germany, he was outraged, not just by the loss of the war, but by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, signed with the victorious Allies in June 1919. It wasn't just that under the terms of the treaty Germany lost territory and had to pay reparations. It was that Germans had to admit they were guilty in starting the war. Hitler was sent on a propaganda course by his superior officer and began talking to soldiers about the dangers of communism. He also joined a small political group in Munich called the German Workers' Party and started giving speeches in beer halls. It was immediately clear that Hitler had a gift for public speaking, and he soon began attracting audiences in Bavaria. Not that he was saying anything particularly original. A number of other nationalists also spoke from much the same script, which was that the German army had been betrayed, Versailles was a crime, socialist politicians and the Jews were behind both the loss of the First World War and the hated ideology of communism. Like others, Hitler also imagined a future of a Volksgemeinschaft, a people's community, where all true Germans could live happily together, free from what they considered alien influences. It's crucial, though, to understand how, from the beginning, Hitler's vision of this people's community was entirely racist. Only those considered of pure racial stock, those thought Aryan, could be German citizens. German Jews, no matter how loyal they were to the state, would be excluded from citizenship. Hitler was instrumental in the German Workers' Party launching its political program at a beer hall in Munich in 1920. Shortly afterwards, they changed the party name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazis for short. But you mustn't get the idea from the word socialist that the Nazis were socialist in the way we understand the concept. Capitalist enterprises would still thrive under the Nazi regime. The socialism Hitler talked about was very much related to how he imagined the Volksgemeinschaft, the idea of one Germany ordered by race. Indeed, a more accurate description of the National Socialist German Workers' Party would have been the Nationalist Racist German Workers' Party, because that's essentially what it was. It was also clear that the Nazis as a party thrived on crisis, and Germany in 1923 was in a desperate situation. The French army had occupied the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of Germany, because the Germans weren't paying their reparations on time. And this, coupled with hyperinflation, was a recipe for enormous political instability. In November 1923, Hitler and the Nazis even tried to start a revolution in Munich. This armed insurrection, known as the Beer Hall Putsch, failed dismally when the Bavarian security forces refused to support the Nazis. Indeed, they opened fire on them as they marched through Munich. At his trial the following year, Hitler came to the notice of the world. Despite being accused of high treason, he gave a series of defiant speeches in the court. It appeared at first sight to be a demonstration of his courage and bravery, but it was a sham. In fact, he knew that the judges were sympathetic to him and that he was almost certainly going to be let off lightly. And he was. Sentenced to 5 years imprisonment for high treason, everyone knew that he was likely to be released much sooner on probation. And that's just what happened. He was released only 9 months after his conviction, in December 1924. But even though Hitler was free, the Nazis did not flourish. By 1925, the political situation appeared to have stabilized in Germany, and without a political crisis to exploit, the Nazis made little inroads into national politics. So much so that 3 years later, in the 1928 German general election, the Nazi Party only received 2.6% of the vote. Think of it. That means that in excess of 97% of all Germans rejected them at the ballot box. Yet less than 5 years after that election, in May 1928, Hitler was Chancellor of Germany and the Nazis were the biggest political party in the country. So when anyone ever tells you about a political party today, oh, don't worry, they're an irrelevance because they're getting less than 3% of the vote. Just remember this story. All of which begs the question, why was there this sudden turnaround? Well, for a number of reasons. Crucially, Germany was hit by a massive economic depression in the wake of the Wall Street crash in 1929. This was especially damaging because Germans were still having to pay the Allies reparations under the Versailles Treaty. Plus, the political system of this new democracy was cracking apart. The president, Paul von Hindenburg, was unsympathetic towards socialists. He was very much a nationalist, and many of those around him distrusted and disliked democracy. The crisis became particularly acute in 1932, when nearly 6 million Germans were unemployed. And it was no coincidence that in this time of turmoil, at the general election in July 1932, the Nazis became the biggest party in Germany, with 37% of the vote. One German woman I met, a student back in the early 1930s, did her best to explain why she and so many of her friends turned to the Nazis. I can probably only explain it
with the poverty the people had been suffering and were suffering. In that context, Hitler, with his statements, seemed to be the bringer of salvation. He said, "I will get you out of this misery, but you all have to join in." And everybody understood that.
Though Hitler never tried to hide that he was an anti-Semite, in the early 1930s he didn't make his hatred of Jews a central part of his pitch to the people. Instead, he focused on the need to create this people's community and of how Germans should all pull together and the importance of destroying democracy in order to make this happen. Significantly, the German Communist Party was also increasing its vote around this time. So much so that something extraordinary happened in the general election of July 1932. which was that a majority of Germans, in voting either for the Nazis or the Communists, were supporting political parties that were openly committed to destroying democracy. It's another crucial warning from this history, I think. Don't imagine that just because democracy has been established, it's necessarily always secure. Remember that in 1932, in truly desperate times, most Germans wanted to vote it away. But even given that the Nazis were now the biggest party, President Hindenburg still wouldn't offer Hitler the chancellorship. He was famously derisive of Hitler. After meeting him, he's supposed to have said the only job Hitler was suitable for was Postmaster General, because then Hitler could lick my backside. It was a crude reference to the fact that Hindenburg's face appeared on the stamps, and so anyone using them would have to lick the back of them. But the political situation didn't stabilise. And by the start of 1933, Hindenburg had finally been convinced by those around him that the only way of making Germany politically stable in the way they wanted was to appoint Hitler as Chancellor, even though Hindenburg knew that democracy would be destroyed in the process. Hindenburg was told by his cronies that Hitler would be restrained by other right-wingers in the new cabinet who were not members of the Nazi Party. So much so that the former Chancellor of Germany, Franz von Papen, famously remarked that we've hired Hitler. It was one of the most consequential political misjudgments in history. And so Hitler became Chancellor of Germany on the 30th of January 1933. Just what he and the Nazis did once they gained power, I'll discuss in the next episode.